Alright, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amirah Zahra, student number 2005086083, and in this occasion, I would like to explain you the sentence processing in psycholinguistics. So, what is sentence processing? So, when language scientists study sentences, they are interested in how people organize words before and during speaking, and they are interested in what cues listeners use to figure out how words in sentences reverse or relate to one another, as those cues are vital in enabling listeners to recover the speaker's intended message. The study of syntax involves discovering the cues that language provides that show how words in sentences relate to one another. The study of syntactic parsing involves discovering how comprehenders use those cues to determine how words in sentences relate to one another during the process of interpreting a sentence. One basic question that language scientists have asked is, are ambiguous sentences like harder to understand than less ambiguous sentences that express about the same meaning? In other words, does ambiguity impose processing costs on the listener or reader? The short answer to this question, to the language scientist question, is yes. Ambiguity leads to longer reading times, lower comprehension accuracy, and different patterns of brain activity in comprehenders than unambiguous sentences that say the same thing. To predict and explain which sentences will be particularly difficult to process, language scientists appeal to the concept of synthetic parsing. Synthetic parsing is a mental process or set of processes that takes sequences of words and organizes them into hierarchical structures, or similar to those in the preceding diagrams. The next, uh, the next presentation, we want to talk about two-stage models of parsing. So, Frazier's gunpowder theory is considered a two-stage model of synthetic parsing because she proposes that synthetic parsing takes place in two distinct processing stages or steps. In the first stage, the incoming sequence of words is analyzed to determine what categories the word belongs to. Categories correspond to part of speech such as noun, verb, preposition, and so on. Once the categories have been identified, the parser can build a synthetic structure for the sequence. The parser does not care which particular words it is looking at. It only wants to know what categories are represented in the input. In the second stage of sentence interpretation, standard meaning is computed by applying semantic flows to structure input. The next one, we want to talk about constraint-based models of parsing. Constraint-based parsing models constitute the most prominent alternative to two-stage models. Constraint-based parsers are capable of pursuing multiple structural possibilities simultaneously. Constraint-based parsers oftentimes adopt a parallel distributed processing or neural network architecture, similar to the one that Tray's model of lexical processing is based on. Constraint-based parsers represent different aspects of sentences, including their synthetic structures as patterns of activation spread across large numbers of interconnected processing units. Constraint-based parsers can draw on a much wider variety of cues to decide what structures to build and the relative emphasis to place on each alternative structure. Constraint-based parsers are often referred to as one-stage models because lexical, synthetic, and semantic processes are all viewed as taking place simultaneously. Constraint-based parsers differ from two-stage parsers like the golden path parser because constraint-based theory says that structural information is associated with individual words in the lexicon, and this information influences with which structural hypotheses will be pursued as sentences are being processed. The next one, we want to talk about the argument structure hypothesis. One possible stop rule for storing synthetic representations is the argument structure hypothesis. According to the argument structure hypothesis, structural information related to a verb's arguments is stored in the lexicon, and everything else is computed on the fly. So, like, figuring out where the me is, we have to figure out what counts as an argument. The argument structure hypothesis will claim, therefore, that only two structural possibilities will be stored in long-term memory and associated with what's reading. So, when comprehenders access the verb form was reading, they would activate two associated syntactic structure, one that did not have a place for a post-verbal object and one that did. How is this information accessed and used during parsing? According to constraint-based parsing theory in general, and the argument structure hypothesis in particular, when listeners access the lexical representation of a verb like was reading, they immediately activate the associated structural information, like the kind of like what happens with predictive semantic processing. The argument structure hypothesis provides a somewhat more nuanced view of how argumenthood influences parsing. According to the argument structure hypothesis, argument frames and their corresponding syntactic structures are important because they determine how some elements of sentences are interpreted. Next one, limitations, criticism, and some alternative parsing theories. The first criticism is based on the suggestion that the parser may not always favor likely structures over less likely but simpler structure. The second criticism of the constraint-based approach relates to the absence of evidence that sentences with simple syntactic structures are ever hard to process. Further criticism of the constraint-based approach to parsing relate to the testability of various constraint-based proposals and the fact that some types of sentence do not seem to be very susceptible to context effects. So this one is we want to talk about next is alternative parsing theories. The first one is control. The control account is essentially a refinement of the classic Gordon path parsing theory. The second one is the race-based parsing. So the race-based account represents a different refinement of the parallel processing approach to parsing. Good enough parsing is Fernando Ferreira's good enough parsing hypothesis represent a recent, more radical departure from the classical approaches to parsing and interpretation. The last one is parsing long distance dependencies. So the relationship between the words in the sentence are classified as local dependencies. Many sentences have long distance dependencies and sometimes called non-local and sometimes called unbounded dependencies, where the words that have close syntactic relationships appear in separate locations in the sentence. Well, I think that's all for me. I'm very sorry that I have passed the time limit, but I hope you guys can take anything that seems important to you from this presentation. And if you guys want to learn more, I will attach the link to my Canva presentation below. So hope you guys enjoy, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.